All right, now let's get into imaginary numbers. So imaginary numbers are a type of number that goes beyond what we usually see on a number line. So they're called imaginary because they involve the square root of a negative number, which is something we can't do with regular real numbers. All right, so let's break it down. Square roots and negative numbers. So when you square a number, right, so 2 squared, when you square that number, it's multiplied by itself. So this is equal to 2 times 2, which is equal to 4. It's always going to be positive because a positive times a positive will always equal a positive, or a negative times a negative will always be a negative. You're never going to have a difference of signs because you're multiplying itself. So if this was negative 2 squared, then it would be negative 2 times negative 2, which would equal 4. So because we're squaring, this is always going to be a positive number. So what happens if you try to do a square root of 4? Well, you're just going backwards, right? So you're going backwards. Square root of 4 is equal to 2, because what number times itself is equal to 4? That's what you're saying. But if you always times your number by itself and it's always going to be positive, then how do you get a negative square? How do you do the square root of a negative number? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in real numbers, but it does exist in imaginary numbers, right? So the imaginary unit I is what we use, or sometimes you might see J, is what we use to handle square roots of negative numbers. And mathematicians created a new number called I, and this number is defined as the square root of -1, square root of -1, right? So I times I is equal to -1 in this instance. And what this allows us to do is, going back to this example here, we can now break this down into -1 times 4, which now we know that square root of 4 is equal to 2. And then this here becomes I. So now we could write this as, usually we write it as 2I with I afterwards. So this is now solved for square root of -4. So we use I to make imaginary numbers. If we need the square root of -9, for instance, right, we could rewrite it as 3I, because -9, square root of -9 equals 3, and the square root of -1 equals I. Now, imaginary numbers let us solve equations that don't have solutions on the regular number line. So remember, going back to our regular number line, we had our real numbers with 0 in the middle, 1, 2, 3, -1, -2, -3. So these are our real numbers. Now, our imaginary numbers are going to be on a y-axis like this, right? So these are going to be our imaginary. And you can see that there is a space for imaginary numbers to exist in this scenario that do not fall on the real number line.